The black-eyed kid experience is both an old and a new phenomenon. It is old in that the existence of evil parading as innocence has been around since the beginning of time, and it is new because the phenomenon has only been widely reported since the advent of the internet, which certainly fuels the discussion and the strangeness of the phenomenon. The phrase black-eyed kids is also modern and encompasses a whole plethora of experiences that are eerily similar.
In general, the encounters are as follows. Kids between the ages of 6 and 16, with pale skin, solid black eyes, and working in groups of 2 or more, arrive at someone's home or vehicle, knock on the door, and then insist on being let inside. Anyone who encounters them reports immediately being overwhelmed with a sense of dread and foreboding. Besides blacked out eyes, these kids typically appear normal, although sometimes their clothing or their language is reported to be outdated. Overall, though, they look like normal kids. In a way, their innocence is what makes them truly terrifying.
While it may not be the earliest sighting of all time, the earliest widely reported sighting was in 1996 by Brian Bethel, a journalist from Abilene, Texas. In Bethel's report, he describes being in his vehicle late one evening. He had pulled into a parking lot near a movie theater to write a check. He was so absorbed in this that he didn't notice 2 young boys approach his car and tap on his driver's side window. Bethel rolled down his window and noted immediately a soul-wrecking fear, though he couldn't understand why.
The older of the 2 boys said that he and his brother wanted to catch a movie, but had forgotten their money at home, and asked Bethel to give them a ride. They assured him that it wouldn't take long, that they were just kids, and that they didn't have a gun. Bethel found their assurances unnerving, and noted that the last showing of the film that they wanted to see had already started and would nearly be over by the time he could drive them anywhere and get back. In his account of the incident, he stated that when he broke eye contact with them, his fear became all-encompassing. And it wasn't until he broke eye contact that their eyes became completely blacked out. The older boy began to get frustrated when Bethel made excuses for not giving them a ride and said that they couldn't get into his car unless Bethel said it was okay. After that, Bethel tore out of the parking lot. To this day, he still stands by his story.
It is easy to disbelieve Bethel's story, particularly with the internet's ability to grow new legends with relative ease. A subgenre of the paranormal, known as creepypasta, has taken this type of experience and run with it. Creepypastas are horror-related legends that have been copied and pasted around the internet. In fact, the name creepypasta is a blending of the words creepy and the action copy and paste. These internet-circulated stories are often brief, user-generated paranormal stories intended to scare readers. They include gruesome tales of murder, suicide, and otherworldly occurrences, and by their nature, most are inherently fictitious.
Is Bethel's story nothing more than creepypasta? Perhaps, but not entirely, as his story predates the genre and the websites that drive it. There is no doubt, however, that as Bethel's story became more widely known, particularly on the internet, it has encouraged a lot of people to come forward with their own black-eyed kid encounters.
Bethel's story is certainly the modern driving force, but it is not the first. One of the earliest known accounts of black-eyed children dates back to 1950 in Virginia, and a 16-year-old boy known only as Harold.
According to the story, the teenager was walking home one afternoon when he came across another boy leaning against a fence, as if waiting for someone. Harold attempted to speak to him but received no response. He was about to walk off and go on his journey when the strange boy suddenly said to Harold, "I want to go to your house. You're going to walk me up to your house."
It was then that Harold noticed the blackness of the boy's eyes. There was no white, just solid black. Then, something even stranger and more chilling happened. Harold had begun to contemplate turning and running home as fast as he could when the boy blurted out,
"Now don't you run away from me. You're going to walk me up to your house."
Harold turned and ran away, faster than his legs had ever carried him before. Later, he recalled to his parents that as he did so, he heard a scream behind him, a scream that sounded very similar to that of a bobcat.
Interestingly, his parents believed their son's account, so much so that his father was said to have grabbed his gun and immediately went out looking for the menacing boy who had demanded his son take him to their family home. His mother apparently thought her son had an encounter with the devil himself and stated that she would take him to see the local priest.
The phenomenon was certainly reported in the 70s and 80s as well. According to investigator David Weatherly, a strange encounter involving black-eyed children occurred in a small village of Ain, France in 1974. The case was originally investigated by Joël Mesnard and Jean-Marie Bijourne and involved two men named only as Elaine G. and Patrick V.
The story goes that while leisurely driving around the small village, the two men stopped their car in front of a house while attempting to do a turn in the road. As they glanced into the property's courtyard, they saw 5 mysterious figures who appeared to be looking at them. The figures were all around 4 feet tall and were all dressed in the same long garments. Their hair was long, seemingly right down to their waists. The strangest thing by far, however, was their solid black eyes.
The figure closest to the man's car gestured to them to come into the courtyard. Unnerved and frightened, the men sped away from the scene. It is claimed that they returned later with more people, but there was no sign of the strange figures they'd seen earlier that day.
When investigators spoke to people in the area, one neighbor stated that he had also seen the strange figures. He believed that they were children and had spotted them playing in the road.
One reported phenomenon with black-eyed kids is that they appear frequently to people who know about them. Is simply knowing about black-eyed kids a precipitating factor in seeing black-eyed kids? It seems that's possible, given the following 2 stories.
It's 11:30 at night in the middle of June, and I'm in my house alone with my dog. I was reading a Reddit post about BEKs and was already pretty shook. I've heard rumors that if you know about them, they'll come visit you. I was sitting on my living room couch when I heard 2 knocks at the front door. My dog immediately hopped up on the couch with me and started trembling. I was startled and hesitantly walked to the front door. My door has 2 slim windows on each side of it to look through, and out the right one I saw 2 kids. One looked really small, like he was maybe 5, and the other one looked like he was at least 9. Like I said, it was the middle of June, and they were both wearing winter coats. I tried to look at their faces, but my porch light wasn't working for some reason. They were both just staring at the door. I'd been staring at them for at least 20 seconds when they both looked up at me through the window on the door. I ran back to my couch as quietly as I could, trying not to make any other noises. There was 2 more knocks, followed by a, "Sir, let us in. Me and my brother are hungry and tired." I was just about screamed. How do they know I'm a man? I waited, and about 10 seconds later I heard, "Let us in. We have to call our mom." It was silent for about a minute before the pounding on my window started again. This time, one of the kids in a very demanding tone said, "Let us in." It was quiet after this for at least 2 minutes, and I thought they were gone until I heard the backyard gate sling open, followed by pounding on my back sliding door. I ran upstairs and locked myself in the bedroom with my dog. They kept pounding for at least a half an hour. The pounding finally stopped, and I put on headphones and tried to sleep, and I've never seen them since.
Last night was an average night. My wife had to be at work at the hospital by 4 a.m., so she was asleep and I was up on baby duty. The baby was fast asleep, so I was listening to some music and watching some YouTube videos to pass the time. One earbud in case she started to cry.
Nice.
It was getting pretty late, so I decided to go ahead and lay down in the spare bed in the baby's room. Just as I dozed off, I heard a thumping sound coming from the front porch. Startled, I opened my eyes wide and scanned the room. I soon realized it was most likely the cat scratching himself on the front porch and dozed back off. Then again, thumping. Damn cat. I got out of bed to run him off the porch, only to find that he wasn't there when I opened the door. Now that I was up again, I was wide awake. Figured I would go ahead and get some tea, check Facebook, maybe finish that web series I was watching on YouTube. A few minutes into the video, I felt a sudden urge to look up at the kitchen window. And that's when I saw them. Heads. 2 heads to be exact, just above the window frame. Whoever they were small, and just short enough not to be able to see in the window. But I could see them. My stomach turned as I listened. No footsteps. But the knock? The knock was a steady, hollow thump. The very same thump I had just blamed on my cat. There was no way I was going to answer that knock. I slowly shut my laptop and crept back to the baby's room. There was some low-income housing across the road, and I assumed it was some people from over there. Drunk, stoned, or perhaps hiding from the cops. My cousin stayed with us sometimes. Maybe it was someone looking for him. The last thing that I needed or wanted was a confrontation with 2 stoners in the middle of the night. When I got back to my daughter's room, that's when the creepiness really set in. The thump had moved from the kitchen to the bedroom windows. Both windows. A room apart, thumping in perfect time. Now I was getting pissed. These stoners were going to wake up my daughter if I didn't run them off. I jumped out of bed, went to the door, unlocked and opened it, ready to run around the side of the house and kick some ass if needed. But when I opened the door, I was shocked to see 2 boys standing there, both only 10 or 11. I was instantly hit with a feeling of dread, and the smell of mold was sickening and almost made me vomit. The smaller of the 2 then spoke. "May we use your telegraph?" What? I just stared blankly, horrified at what I then realized. Their eyes were pitch black. He asked again to use the telegraph. It was then that I realized it was dead silent. No sounds. No crickets chirping. No dogs barking. No cars driving by. Nothing. I tried to play it cool and ignore the fact that he didn't say telephone, or phone, or cell phone. Anything that would have made more sense than telegraph. Anything that would have made sense of the situation at all. I then calmly replied, "I don't have service at my house. Sorry." The expressions on their face turned to rage as I finished my sentence. I swiftly shut the door and locked it, and stumbled as quickly as I could through the dark house back to my daughter's bedroom. My only instinct was to protect her. I picked her up out of the crib and held her close. She didn't wake up, and that freaked me out the most, but I was able to gather my senses enough to make sure she was okay. She was still breathing. She was warm. It was then that the thumping on the window started again. I dropped down to the floor, crawled as close as I could to the wall, holding my little girl in my arms. I'm a grown man, and I wept like a child that night. I felt helpless and afraid. I lied there for what felt like hours and hours, crying and shaking, until I heard it. My wife's alarm clock. Instantly, the thumping stopped. I got off the floor and crept into the master bedroom. "What's wrong with you?" my wife asked. "I just had a bad dream," is all I could mutter out. My wife asked me to hand her the baby so that she could feed her before work, and I handed her over. The day felt normal. I turned on every light in the house and made some coffee. For some reason, just having her awake calmed my nerves enough to pretend like nothing happened. When it was time for her to go to work, I walked her out to the car, nervously, with the baby in my arms, and asked her not to leave until I walked back into the house. She looked at me strangely, but humored me. Once I was safely in the house, I locked the doors again, and there I sat, the entire day, horrified until she got home. When she did get home, I insisted we go to the next town over and stay the weekend at my brother's house. And here I sit, horrified, while she sleeps in the guest room with my daughter. I've been wondering why they stopped when the alarm went off. I think I know the answer. I was aware of black-eyed kids. She wasn't. Every story I've ever read about them is from someone who already knew about them. Maybe, just maybe, knowledge of them existing is the only reason they visit.
So, you may be asking yourself, what happens if you let black-eyed kids into your house or vehicle? While most stories don't explore this aspect of the phenomena, either because they didn't let the entities into their home, or simply didn't survive to tell the tale. There is at least one account of a person letting black-eyed kids into their home, and they have been paying for it ever since.
Let me start by saying that I know how hard this all will be to believe, but now that things have taken a turn for the worse, I started looking for stories similar to mine and found Week in Weird. I feel like I should share this story with someone, and your website seems like the right place. I made the mistake of letting the black-eyed kids inside, and now I'm worried that I might die because of it. I hope this will be a warning to everyone who is ever in the position to make the same mistake that I did. I live just outside of a rural town in Vermont. It's a tight-knit community where everyone knows one another and people don't lock their doors at night. There's never been any need to. A little over a year ago, I woke up because I heard a loud banging on my front door. At the time, my husband and I lived in a small home on a dirt road just off the rural route into town. It was the middle of a snowstorm, and the nearby hills get very slippery in the snow, so I thought that someone might have been in an accident and broken down. It's happened before. When I looked out the window, I could see that our motion spotlight was on. I could see that there were footprints in the snow that had come from our road and into our driveway, but there was no car anywhere. The snow was still covering the road, and no one had driven on it for at least a couple hours. Our front door was obscured from the window, but I could see that someone was standing there. I wasn't sure what to think, so I woke up my husband just to feel safer. While I was telling him what was going on, the banging on the door started again, and my husband went to answer it while I stood in the hallway. When he opened the door, there were two children standing in the snow looking toward the ground. They were a boy and a girl who could not have been more than 8 years old. They were dressed strangely and had odd haircuts. The girl's hair was very long and straight, and the boy had a dated haircut that looked almost like a bowl cut. They weren't dressed for winter, and my first thought was they must have been Mennonite children, but as far as I know, there was never a large community of Mennonites near us. Thinking back on it, I know my normal reaction to seeing children in a snowstorm would have been to rush them inside and bundle them up with some blankets and hot cocoa. But that's not how this felt. The children were very unnerving. They would not make eye contact, and when my husband asked them if everything was okay, they asked if they could come in. My husband looked at me like, what do I do? And I asked the kids where their parents were. "They'll be here soon," is all they said. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning at this point, so the only reasonable thought in my head was that there must have been an accident or these kids got lost. As much as my instincts told me not to bring them inside, I did it anyway. I went into the kitchen to make them some hot cocoa while my husband took them into the living room. While I was fixing the kettle, I could hear my husband talking to the kids. He was asking them if they were okay, where they came from, how far they walked, if their parents' car was broken down, things like that. But they always answered, "Our parents will be here soon." They spoke in a sing-songy voice. They weren't afraid to be in a stranger's home at all. I started to notice our cats, we had 4, were all hiding except for Pigeon, who was in the kitchen with me. Normally, our cats are very curious and friendly, and we have to be careful that they don't run out the door when we leave. This time, none of them even tried to see who was here, which I thought was very strange. All of the hair on Pigeon's neck was standing up and his tail was puffed up while he looked in the living room. When I bent down to pet him and to see what was wrong, he hissed and started growling and backed up until he had hid himself under the kitchen island. I haven't seen him do that before. When I walked back into the living room, the kids were sitting on the couch as still as can be, but my husband was holding his head in his hands. I asked him what's wrong, and he just said he felt very dizzy all of a sudden, but he was fine. I turned back to look at the children to give them their cocoa, but when they looked at me, I gasped. It took everything inside of me not to drop the mugs and run away. When they looked at me, their eyes were completely black. They had no whites, just giant black pupils. When they saw that I was scared, they stood up and asked if they could use the bathroom. I tried to be as composed as I could be and showed them down the hall. They went into the bathroom together, and I hurried back to my husband to ask him if he had seen their eyes. He had seen them too and said that it looked like his brother's badly bruised eyes after a car accident. We were in the middle of talking about whose children they could have been when my husband's nose started to bleed. He never had nosebleeds as long as I have known him. I just knew inside myself that this had something to do with the kids in the bathroom, and I started crying while I ran to get my husband some tissues. That's when the power went out. I heard my husband yell my name from the living room, and as I started to walk back through the hallway, I stopped dead in my tracks. The 2 children were standing at the end of the hallway. They weren't moving, and I have never been so scared in my whole life. They just stood there in the dark. After what felt like forever, the boy said, "Our parents are here." And they walked to the door, opened it, and walked out, leaving it wide open. My husband jumped up to go close it and almost fell over. We looked outside the window and saw 2 men standing by a black car idling at the end of our driveway. The men looked like they were wearing black-colored suits and were very tall, at least 6 feet. When my husband waved at them, they just stared at us, got into the car, and drove off. Our power came on about a half hour later, but nothing was the same after that. Over the next few months, 3 of our cats went missing. We can only assume that they ran away somewhere and never came back. But the worst thing was coming home to find Pigeon in a puddle of blood on the living room floor. He looked like he had been vomiting blood. The vet told us that he had some kind of hemorrhage. After my husband's nosebleeds became a regular occurrence, we went to see the doctor. He didn't know what to make of it, other than dry nasal passages. But my husband was diagnosed with an aggressive skin cancer. When the doctor asked us if he used tanning beds, we both thought he was joking. But apparently, this kind of melanoma is linked to overuse of indoor tanning. The doctors think he will recover, but don't understand how it got so bad so quickly. My husband has never worked an outdoor job and spends relatively little time in the sun. Since we let the black-eyed kids inside our home, I've also suffered from regular dizzy spells and nosebleeds on a regular basis. I've had other issues, which I won't mention here, but trust me when I say I am suddenly in the worst condition of my life, and no one can do anything about it. I know that all of this is because I let the black-eyed children into my home. We've told everyone we could about the strange kids that showed up that night, but no one else saw them, and some laugh at how scared we were of the Mennonite kids. But we know what we saw. I wish my husband had never opened the door. Feel free to publish this as a warning to others about the black-eyed kids. My advice would be to lock your doors, call the police, and wait for mourning. Don't make the same mistake I did.
So what are they? No one really knows. The people who claim to have seen them swear they're legit. Others aren't so convinced. Theories abound and suggest that they are urban legend, internet lore, ghosts, demons, aliens, or even vampires. The most interesting theory concerning the origin of black-eyed kids perhaps comes from an Iroquois Indian legend. According to this legend, the kids may be something called Otcon. The Iroquois Indian believe in a dark power called the Octon that would take over children, and an evil one who would mate with human females to produce black-eyed, chalky-skinned children. These children were killed by the tribe soon after birth and burned to stop them from resurrecting. Children wandering alone in the woods could also be taken over by Octon and would re-emerge with black eyes and pale skin, acting nervously while repeating themselves over and over. Their goal was to destroy the tribe and infect all the people with Octon.
Another interesting theory is that these entities may be fairies. This theory comes out of Ireland.
I'm originally from Ireland. I moved to the States roughly 20 years back. This story takes place in County Clare, Ireland, when I was about 15 years old. One afternoon, I was walking through the woods near my home. I was alone. I was a loner in my youth, and I would often stroll the woods until I found a tree to sit beneath and write. Writing has always been my hobby. My point is that I was very familiar with these woods. I felt safe there. On this particular day, I was walking a path to the specific tree that was my favorite to sit beneath. The sounds of the woods were all around me. There was a gentle breeze, and while I couldn't see the birds, I could hear them. It was comforting. And then it all stopped. Everything became unnaturally still. The air was still, the birds stopped twittering. I no longer heard a single thing. I never experienced this before. It was as if I had suddenly become deaf. There was just nothing. No sound, no movement, no breeze. At this point I started to become anxious. I wasn't yet afraid, but I started home anyway. The feeling in the woods was not what I was used to. I was no longer comforted, so I decided to go home. It was then that I saw movement from the corner of my eye. Nothing I could pinpoint, but a dark shape that was just there. And then it wasn't. Everything else was still that eerie calm. I started to walk faster, and then the black shape again, this time on my other side. And I was afraid. I began to run. I still heard nothing, but I was sure something was chasing me. When I reached my home, I ran inside and slammed the door, fully expecting my mom to yell at me for the slamming. But she wasn't there. In fact, nobody was home. It was a bit odd, but not unheard of. Finally, gaining some sanity, I decided I needed tea. Now. So I began to boil the water for the tea. Then there was a knock at the door. I jumped. My heart rose to my throat. Nobody knocked in these parts. It was a small village where everyone knew everyone else. Everyone was family. There was no knocking. There was friendly "Oi there!" And then people came in, so a knock was strange. I crept over to the glass in the door and peeked out. I noticed two things right away that terrified and confused me. The first was a child. A girl of maybe 10 or 12, looking not at me, but at her feet. The second thing scared me to my toes. It was getting dark. How was that possible? I'd left to go on my walk in midday. The sun had been fully out, and I'd been gone no longer than 40 minutes. How then was it dark? I looked at the clock. It was almost 7. How? How had I misplaced 5 hours? The clock came again, and I jumped again. I didn't open the door. I called out, "Oi there, can I help ya?" The girl didn't look up. She said, "I need to come in. Please let me in." She had no accent. She wasn't Irish. There was no lilt to her voice. She sounded American. I called out again, "I can't let you in, but I'll ring someone if you need help." The child still didn't look up. She said, "No, that won't work. I need to come in." At that point, I'd had enough of the scary child. She was freaking me out. I wanted my mum. I wanted my dad. I wanted to know where 5 hours of my life had gone. I was so frightened at this point that not even tea was going to help. So I did what any teenage girl would do when faced with a situation such as this. I screamed and ran to my bed, covered myself with my blanket, and waited for my mom to come home. This was pre-cellular phones, and I was not going to risk going to the kitchen to phone someone. Plus, I still had no idea who I would call. The girl was still knocking at the door, but she never moved to a window or to the back door. She stayed at the front door. After a while, I got up my nerve to go check again. It had been silent for a bit. I went to the door and looked out the glass. The girl was still there, but she was no longer at the door. She was sitting on the fence. She was no longer looking down. She was looking right at me, and in the fading light, it looked like her eyes were pitch black. I screamed again and ran back to the safety of my blanket. Eventually, my mom came home. I told her what happened. She decided that it was my overactive imagination, but she did call down to the shops and the pub to find out if anyone in town had American family visiting, or if anyone knew who the girl was. Nobody did. My grandmother told me that I had survived an encounter with the Fae, the fairies, and that I was lucky. The Fae are said to be evil and will kidnap children in the woods, and the woods was near a fairy hill. She was the only one who ever believed me. I never saw the girl again. I never had missing time again. I never felt the absolute stillness in the woods again when I got up my courage to go back. After I moved to the States and years later, I heard of the black-eyed children. My story seemed to coincide with that, but that's ridiculous, right? I still have no explanation. Demon, fairy, ghost, black-eyed child. I don't know, but it happened. I swear to that. Update. I found my Gran. Gran at this point is well into her 90s, and she doesn't understand the interwebs as she calls them. I asked her a bit more about the limitations of fairies. She had some input that I'll share with you here. I'll do my best to use her words here. She said that the Fae are divided into two groups, those that are evil and collect souls, specifically of children, to act as slaves to the Fae King, and those that are kind and like to help humans. It is said that the evil Fae are in fact known to take the shape of a human child or a beautiful woman, depending on the prey, as those are the two shapes that are most pleasing and will garner the most sympathy from humans. She did not have information regarding the eyes of the Fae, but she did say that the Fae cannot enter a person's home, because that is protected by human energy. She did not know if they could enter if invited, but she didn't see why not, since that would lower the guard that surrounds the home. My Gran has never heard of black-eyed children. However, she did say that when the Irish first came to America, they brought relics and pieces of the fairy hills with them. She said another thing that I didn't even ask her about, but that she gave to me without prompt. She said that the Fae are attracted to thoughts of themselves, meaning that if you spend a great deal of time thinking of them or speaking of them, that you are more likely to come across one. Well, I thought that was interesting since I didn't ask her about that, but if I remember correctly, that is part of the black-eyed children lore. As a final thought, she said you can protect yourself by salting your windows and doors and saging the inside of your home.